Okay, in this lesson, we're going to talk about how new species form. We call it speciation. We so far have been talking about the theory of natural selection and how organisms can change slowly over time, but we haven't talked at all about how you would get a whole new species. According to the theory of natural selection, eventually you could develop a new species through this process of natural selection, but this is only going to occur if we have what's called geographic isolation. That is, if populations of organisms are separated geographically, they cannot come together and they're completely isolated from one another, then you could develop a new species. So gradually, populations will change due to changes in the environment. If they never have an opportunity to mate, if they never can come together and join together their genes, then slowly, with changes in the environment, you could develop different populations, so much so that they are now completely different species. So one example of this are spotted owls. You may have heard of spotted owls because they were really in the news a few decades ago when we were cutting down the forest and they were endangered, and it was the loggers against the environmentalists and all of that. You know, there's a whole history behind that. But what has happened is there used to be, all along from British Columbia all the way south into Mexico, one big population of spotted owls. Strix occidentalis is their scientific name. And what's happened is humans have come in and we've cut down the forests, cut down a lot of the habitat where they lived, and what's happened is now they're isolated. We have one population that's the northern population of spotted owls, and then we have this southern population of spotted owls, and they never mate anymore because they're too far away. If you think about, like, this is down in Arizona, and this is way in Northern California. It's too far for them. They don't usually travel that far in their habitat. So now we have two separate populations of the spotted owls, and they've gotten to the point now where we have two subspecies. We have the lucida and the corina subspecies, and probably if they never ever come together, they will become new species, and we'll probably see that in our lifetime. Okay, sometimes we see speciation happening where a variety of new species, a bunch of them, evolve from a single ancestor. When this happens, we call this adaptive radiation. So think of like rays of light coming out from the sun. All these organisms are radiating out from this common ancestor. This happens when there's a single new species or a couple of new species that enters a new environment that has previously not been inhabited. An example of this is what we call Darwin's finches. These are finches that live on the Galapagos Islands. There are 13 different species of finch, and they believe that they all descended from a single species that came from the mainland out to the islands. And because there were no other finches on the islands, the various Galapagos Islands, this single species evolved into all these 13 different species of finch. They all sort of took over different habitats and became all these different species. So adaptive radiation looks something like this. We have an ancestral species, and every one of these little branches is what we call a divergence. Okay, some branches maybe lead to extinction, but we might have branches that lead to all these 5 separate species over time. And here's a diagram showing Darwin's finches. This is only 3 of the 13 different, but we might have an ancestor finch, and through natural selection, adaptive radiation, we might have a bird that's evolved for eating insects. We might have a bird that has a woodpecker-type beak for eating insects inside trees. And then we might have another one that has a thick bill for eating seeds, for cracking open seeds. So they're each eating something different and probably not necessarily reproducing with one another, and you end up getting different species over time. Okay, another thing that I want you to understand is something called convergent evolution. And this is over time, organisms that are distantly related may take on similar traits because they live in similar environments, they have similar lifestyles. An example is a dolphin and a shark. You may have noticed that dolphins and sharks have similar body forms. They look very similar. But remember, a dolphin is a mammal, a shark's a fish. So they're not related really very closely to one another, but they look almost exactly the same. This is a case of convergent evolution, and this is where an organism, it's really adapted to its environment. It's taken on a particular form because of its lifestyle. So here we can see the shark and its torpedo-shaped body for swimming fast. And here's the dolphin, almost exactly the same body form. Notice the tail's a little different because they evolved differently, but you've got that single dorsal fin, you've got the pectoral fins, the torpedo-shaped body. And then here's another example. Here's a penguin, and that's what they look like when they're swimming, exactly the same body form. And again, remember, a penguin's a bird. And then here's another example. This is an extinct organism known as an ichthyosaur. And these ichthyosaur look just like dolphins, but of course they're fish. So here we have, or actually I apologize, that's a reptile, it's a dinosaur. So here we have a reptile, here we have a fish, here we have a mammal, here we have a bird. They look all almost exactly the same in terms of body form because they're living in similar environments and having similar lifestyles. Okay, the other thing you need to understand is that sometimes natural selection does not favor changes. Sometimes, in fact, natural selection favors things staying the same. This is called stabilizing selection. And remember, mutations that are harmful don't continue in the population. So these changes sometimes are harmful, so there's a preference in nature for things staying the same, status quo. Examples of this are sharks, turtles, a variety of turtles, and then fern plants. They've remained unchanged for millions of years. So we see in the fossil record, turtles very much like the turtles we have today, sharks very much like the sharks we have today, and of course fern plants, relatively unchanged. And it's because it works. Whatever the lifestyle is, the adaptations that turtles have, the lifestyle of the sharks, it works for them, and there's no reason for change to have occurred. This is called stabilizing selection. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this lesson is coevolution. Coevolution is this idea that sometimes organisms evolve together. They influence each other's evolution. And this is whenever different organisms interact in an environment. They have a relationship with one another. For instance, predators and prey. Because they relate to each other and they interact with each other in the environment, they evolve together. It's like little changes in one affect little changes in the other. So for instance, the predator might evolve to better catch the prey. The prey will evolve to get away from the predator. And slowly over time, they're both changing and they're changing together. Here's another example of this. We have the hummingbird and we have the flower that it feeds on. Notice that the flower has this long tube and the nectar's at the bottom of the tube. That's just the way that this flower is structured. And notice also that the hummingbird has the long bill for siphoning down inside that flower. And so clearly the flower and the hummingbird are evolved together. The flower has the long tube because it wants the bird to come as close as possible to its pollen and to collect the pollen for it so that it can be reproducing. And of course, the hummingbird wants to evolve the longest bill as possible to get that nectar because that's its food source. Here's another example. This is a special species of ant that lives on acacia trees, and they have evolved to co-evolve, the acacia and the ant, to sort of help each other. It's a case of one organism helping another. So we have the ant living on the acacia tree, and the acacia has evolved actually these thorns, and the thorns are hollow inside, and the ants actually live inside there. You can see the little hole right there where they climb inside, and the acacia tree actually makes some sweet nectar that the ants enjoy eating, and it's found down here in the bottom of the thorns and at the base of the thorns. And in return, the ants defend the acacia tree against predators. So predators that are going to come, actually herbivores, that are going to come and eat the acacia tree, the ants will keep them away. And so the ants have evolved to sort of do that, and acacia trees have evolved to have this nice home for the ants to live in. So it's a case of coevolution in a positive way. So that's it for this lesson. These notes go on page 19, I believe, in your notebook.